Years ago, I was on a podcast with a friend of mine, or we were making a podcast. It was largely a more technicals oriented podcast, technology oriented podcast. But our first episode, I believe it was our first episode, was all about the concept of doing things the hard way. Our general idea, or the position that we came to this conversation from, was really that each of us believed in our own ways that there's a great benefit to at least learning how to do things the hard way, even if you don't always do them the hard way from there out. So the idea being, the way we were talking about this in this particular episode, we were both developers, so we were talking about, coding things from scratch as opposed to using some off-the-shelf system that maybe would get you 90% of the way there. Our position was that there was benefit to learning how to build these things and learning the guts of them and learning how to really make something yourself instead of just jumping to purchasing something, a service or whatever. Now, I think it's pretty obvious, particularly when it comes to technology, over the last decade and a half, which this podcast was probably from about, 14, 15 years ago. Over the last decade and a half, obviously at the company level, companies are far more willing to, generally speaking, to go and purchase some, cloud service, software package, whatever it is, rather than going through a major in-house development effort. That wasn't always the case. If you rewind 20, 30 years, there was a lot more in-house development that organizations would do. But either way, at the company level, obviously, just due to sheer expertise, staffing, ease of maintenance, all sorts of things, the purchase of things off the shelf, so to speak, has won out well above and beyond big major in-house development efforts. That's a little bit of a side tangent. That's not quite what I'm talking about here. I would still posit that at the individual level, it really does make a lot of sense in many areas of life, not just within technology, to learn how to do things the difficult way, or the ground. And when I say difficult way, I mean from the ground up, doing as much of it as possible yourself so that you really learn the guts and the ins and outs of a particular process or maintenance item, or, take, home ownership. Like, it behooves you once to go try a plumbing project or, something to that effect if you've never done it before, just so you sort of figure out how to do these things. And we live in a world, ironically, at this point, that it's easier than ever to get the information to learn how to do something yourself. And yet I think people less and less do that. And it's definitely true. Again, we can talk about it from all different angles. Technology has become like this. There's just so many services out there that do so many different things very easily for a cheap price that why would you bother building some of these things yourself? From a home ownership standpoint, fewer and fewer people, of course, really are adept at using tools or understand the guts of a house or a car or whatever. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is the argument of why reinvent the wheel? If it's already a solved problem, why bother, learning how to do it at all? My general thoughts on that are that if you don't know how something works, as soon as you get beyond the 80% use case, it's hard to understand what's going on and conceptualize it. And you can get caught off guard. And partly also just my personality is such that I kind of believe that as much as possible, you should accumulate as many, or I like to accumulate as many skills as possible so that I feel like I can really do things when they come up, as opposed to just calling someone to do them for me, or buying a thing to fix a problem or whatever. I do like kind of getting my hands dirty, so to speak. I've been thinking recently about how this all dovetails into the AI revolution that the world is currently undergoing and will probably likely continue to undergo for quite some time. So again, I'll back out and talk about from like a technology standpoint, just because it's kind of an easy one to dive into. I wonder to what extent, people coming up now, developers and whatnot, will really know how to build certain things at a more granular level, given that AI can get you 80-90% of the way there, and then you finish off that last 10. But finishing off that last 10, if you don't understand the underlying 80 or 90, I think will become increasingly difficult. On the flip side of this, I also wonder to myself, is this really any different than things were when I was coming up as a developer? By the time I was coming up, languages like Java were still around, but the world was getting increasingly more invested in things like Python and .NET and like sort of that next higher level of language. But even at the Java level, there's a world of difference between writing something in Java and writing something down at the more machine code level, or those lower level languages, even a C or a C++. The level of writing there, and I'm sure that there were people at that time looking at the higher order languages that I really came up through, looking at that saying, well, they don't really know how to write real code. They don't understand how it's really working under the hood. So I don't know if it's any different or not. And I've been just kind of tossing this back and forth in my head, particularly within the context of, again, this concept, this kind of value that I've always held of, if you can, learn how to do something from the ground up first, then layer all your stuff on that makes it easier. I've also always taken issue. We've heard this saying, work smart, not hard, that kind of thing. I've always taken issue with this phrase because I don't see them as mutually exclusive things. You don't have to pick one or the other. You can work very, very smart and work very, very hard at the same time. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And so if you're going to be using a lot of, not just you, but we as a species, or if we're going to be using a lot of these new AI technologically advanced kind of tools more and more throughout our life, it still behooves us to learn how to do things in sort of a difficult way so that we then can make the most out of using these great new things. It's not a lot different than when search, like the web and the internet and search engines were really all coming into popularity. And I remember coming up through school and having, research librarians and whatnot and teachers saying, well, don't just go to Google or Yahoo, or whatever, and don't just search and just find a web page. You still need to learn how to do proper research. And over time, what I realized was it's okay to go out and find non-peer reviewed information. The point is not that only peer-reviewed, deep research journals are a good source of information. The point is, if you learn how to navigate through peer-reviewed, deep journal entry kind of stuff, then when you're out evaluating things that are not from that kind of background, you're much better at evaluating whether or not any given thing is a worthwhile, piece of research or piece of information. All this is to say, I think as we've gone through the last decade and a half, we've all become used to things just being easier. all the stuff you want to buy shows up at your house. Anything you want to code, you can get 80, 90% of the way there with ChatGPT. Any piece of information you want is at your fingertips. It has freed us all, again, if you're a homeowner, getting a hold of one of a dozen people to come and do any given thing for you is very simple. But I think it behooves us as a culture to at least continue on some level of learning how to do these things under the hood. Because if you don't at least understand these things or can do some of them, then you'll always be beholden on those items to other forces. And they may or may not be advantageous for you in the long run. And it behooves all of us to just remember that it's okay to work smart and hard at the same time.